Hi, everybody. Welcome to this YA science fiction, fantasy, or speculative fiction debut panel. This is the penultimate, which I think is the right term for the one before the last one. I, I didn't fact check that. I was like, yeah, that sounds right. So I'm so excited to be chatting with these wonderful debuts. We are also basically almost at the end of the year and also like at the end of the panels as well. So it's just ultimately so exciting to be chatting today. If you don't know who I am, my name is Lily. I am the moderator for this panel, and I'm the face behind Utopia State of Mind. And so now we're going to have our authors introduce themselves. Later, we will be having some time for questions. So if you have any, drop them in the live chat, and we're going to start with author introductions with Nicole.
Hi, Lily. Thank you so much for having me on. And I'm sure I speak for everyone. Thanks for all of us. So I'm Nicole. I live right around the Philadelphia area in Pennsylvania. And my book that came out this year is A Misfortune of Lake Monsters, which is about a young woman who wants to leave her rural Pennsylvania town, but can't because she's been tapped by her family to take over their generations-long legacy of secretly impersonating the town's lake monster to keep tourists coming in. And then she finds a real lake monster in the lake who's pretty dangerous and wants to eat the town, and she has to break the secret in order to save the town.
That's so cool. Hi, my name's Jill Tu. I am a middle grade and YA sci-fi romance author living in Atlanta, Georgia. And my debut, The Dividing Sky, oops, this way. I'm so used to like the image being reversed this way. Just came out about 3 weeks ago with Penguin Random House. And it is a young adult dystopian romance set in a near future hyper-capitalist Boston about a girl who uses her neurochip to illegally deal happy memories and the handsome rookie determined to arrest her.
I haven't gotten a chance to read your book yet, but I'm very excited, especially by like the Boston setting of yours. As someone who's originally from Boston, hi, I'm A.R. Vishni, and while I am from Boston, I currently live in New York City. And my debut novel is Night Owls, which is a YA contemporary fantasy set in Manhattan, and it follows two Estries, which are these bread-eating, owl-shifting women vampires from Jewish folklore. And they live in a movie theater in the East Village. And the older sister, Clara, has a rule against dating that the younger sister, Molly, just totally ignores. So when her girlfriend, Anat, goes missing, they have to team up with their charmingly useless box office attendant who can see dead people and face down like ghosts and demons in order to find her.
Perfect. My first question has to do obviously with debuts. This is a debut panel, so all of these are your first books out in the world in this genre and age group as well. So I want to know, what was the first image of your book? And can you talk us through your journey to publication? It's one of my favorite questions because I think everybody has such a different story that I found when I've been doing these panels. So those are my questions. Nicole, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So lake monsters started for me when I was a little kid. My least favorite chore in the world was doing dishes. And it was the thing that was my thing to do at the house. So I'd be standing at the sink, looking out this window above the sink, and about a mile behind my childhood home is this little lake. And because I was bored, it was a small town, I didn't have a lot to do. You have to make your own fun, right? So I would imagine all the terrible things that could be living below the surface of the lake. And the idea of a lake monster, of course, was one of those ideas. And then it stuck with me for a really long time. And as an adult, I was probably like around 30, let's say, I randomly got this poster of Lake Monsters of America. And I'd stare at it in my little writing office, and the idea of this lake monster came back to me. And within probably like a week, I had this really strange idea that wouldn't leave me alone, like a fake lake monster and a real one. And that's sort of how it started. But my publication journey is a lot more varied, I think, than that. So I had been agented for about 10 years the first time I was with an agent. And Lake Monsters was written with that agent, but didn't go out on submission with that agent. She, at that time I was ready to go, pulled back the number of people she was representing, and I was somebody who got cut. And it didn't take me very long to find a second agent, and she took it out on submission, and it didn't go anywhere. So I was feeling kind of like I needed a break from sort of the pressure of, someone expecting something of me in terms of writing. So my agent and I parted ways, and I was really like gonna take a break. And randomly, I saw that Camcat, who's a small publisher, was accepting manuscripts from unagented writers. So I'm like, meh, sure. And within like a month of submitting it, they had acquired it, and here we are. Kind of a weird story and a long story, but I'm sort of glad that it turned out that way. It was sort of the best possible world, I think, going with a smaller publisher. It worked out.
Here, I can jump in. So yeah, no, for me, the first image, or I think the thing I really started with for Night Owls was place. So most of the action takes place like in this stretch of Second Avenue in the East Village that at one point in history was the Yiddish Rialto. It was the site of all the like Yiddish theater in New York City. And I found that history really interesting as someone who had lived down in the Village when I was in law school. And I love that neighborhood. I spend a lot of time there, even though I don't live down there anymore. But then, flash forward to the pandemic. I am sitting at home. My first book that I had like signed my agent wasn't my first book. The book I signed my agent with was dying a very slow death on sub. And I needed something new and something that could get me excited again about writing. So what I went with was, like, what's my favorite place? Where do I wish I was right now instead of my apartment? And like, what are all the things I love? I mean, especially too, I loved like the movie theaters down there, the restaurants, the cafes, the bakeries, and like being around people. So that ended up becoming the basis for the story. And it was just, throwing all of that kind of in one manuscript. And then, that took about a year. And then like, we went out and slept with it. And, it was a funny thing where it felt like forever because we went out on sub like in June. And then we didn't hear anything. And I was like, oh, darn it. Great. That's, this is going to be another like 2 years of suffering through rejection. But then in the end, like a few months later, it sold. So it was actually pretty quick. And, even though it felt like a million years.
I'm going to answer these questions in reverse order because one kind of informs the other. So as far as my writing journey, I loved writing in school, just kind of for fun. I would write little poems and stuff for my friends. And then when it came time to pick a career and kind of go the more practical or choose a college, my parents insisted that I do something more practical. And so I enrolled in an undergraduate business school that like barely left enough room to breathe for like any sort of creative passion, let alone like a minor. So I didn't do a minor in any sort of writing program. I graduated from school. I had a very like corporate, like management consulting job for a while, burned out of that. I went to work at a startup, was on the verge of burning out from that when some friends suggested that we go see a movie after work. And I went to go see a movie with my coworkers about 10 years ago, and it was Divergent, which, famous like YA dystopian story. And walking home from that theater, I remember feeling this spark that I hadn't felt in years. I remembered how much I loved science fiction stories, how much I loved storytelling. And I wanted people to be, I wanted to make people feel that way, to feel like inspired and feel feelings about our own world compared to this fictional world. And I realized I didn't want to make spreadsheets anymore. I wanted to tell stories. And so I ended up going home that night, and instead of starting to work on a PowerPoint deck or whatever it was that I was working on at that point, maybe a spreadsheet or something, I began outlining this parallel universes story that I'd had in my brain kind of for a long time. And it took me 6 years to finish that draft and then another year to revise it. But that book ended up getting me my agent. So that was kind of 7 years later, finally got agented. And that book also died on sub. So props to the died on sub connection. But while it was on sub, I began thinking about another story, and I wanted to write a YA at that time. And I was thinking about all the jobs that I'd had before I began writing, and how I would be so busy that I would outsource parts of my life. So I would hire someone to deliver food for me, or watch my dog, or do my laundry. And I would use that to kind of carve out time for myself. And I would never fill that time with anything meaningful for myself. I would always fill it with more work. And so I began thinking about a world where technology advances to the point where we could outsource anything. In the world of the dividing sky, there's proxies that watch people's kids for them or deliver groceries or other goods. Proxies also go on dates for their clients. So like my proxy and my husband's proxy could go on a date and come back. And so I just wanted to kind of think of a world where we're outsourcing all of it so that we can stay productive. And kind of at what point, if ever, would somebody stand up and say, actually, enough is enough. I want to live life for myself.
So I want to now also ask about the setting. So I want to first start with Misfortune of Lake Monsters and Night Owls, because those ones feel very much kind of like a contemporary setting in which, where you're familiar with the places. Some names you might hear might be familiar. So for both of you, with your, you add your unique twist to it as well. So what challenges and benefits do you think that this had for your writing and for the setting? AR, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think for me, the sort of fantasy elements almost like grew out of this idea. Like once I knew I wanted to set something in the East Village, because what I find interesting about the neighborhood is that there's a lot of history that feels like it's hidden in plain sight. So it's not totally obvious if you're just walking down the street. But like specifically, there's a scene in the book that, where the characters encounter something that is real. It's like this is like the Yiddish Walk of Fame, which had been put down like on the sidewalk it's actually like in the 80s by like a deli that was there that is now a Chase Bank, because of course it's a Chase Bank. And it's interesting because you walk by it and you wouldn't notice, and they're so worn down you can hardly read the names, but it is there if you look down. And throughout the neighborhood, there's things like that. So what was kind of fun was just taking those like landmarks and historical moments that I knew about, and especially the way it sort of presents in the neighborhood, and kind of extending that or literalizing it and turning it into something a little bit magical. So that was kind of fun for me. It also, gave me a chance to just bring forward a lot of the history I find interesting into the present. Because if it's a, ghost or something, you can just kind of have them show up, even though it's like 2024 and people know how to use smartphones.
I think our reasoning for setting them in our places is kind of the same, AR. So because I grew up in a very rural place in Pennsylvania, my setting is that town. I just renamed it to protect the innocent. So the interesting part about that, though, is when you're talking about lake monsters, there is a very, very specific reference point that people think of, and that's Loch Ness. And the lake that I chose as the setting for A Misfortune of Lake Monsters is huge, like Loch Ness. It's not like the small little lake in my town. And so I was able to go to Scotland to do some research for the book to sort of get sort of the vibe of sort of what that kind of a huge lake looks like, what it sounds like, what you can see where huge monsters could live, and sort of how you might mistake ripples in the water or a log in the water as a lake monster. And the challenge and the benefit of that are kind of the same. People, because they know, most people anyway, know what the Loch Ness monster is, there are some expectations that you can take advantage of, but then also subvert in other ways. And if someone has been to Loch Ness, for instance, if you don't get something quite right, that can take people out of the story Not to mention that there are all these speculative elements about what a lake monster might be or where it might have come from. And everybody sort of has their own theory about sort of what the Loch Ness monster is, or, if it's real, if it's not. And I think that that both helps and hurts. It really does. But at the same time, you know, one of the things about lake monsters that was really fun for me was because the Loch Ness monster is a cryptid, you have this universal sort of issue about cryptids, and they're everywhere. There is not a place on the planet that doesn't have its own cryptid. And that's really fun too, mostly because of the huge rabbit hole of research I was able to go down on that. But because everybody has their own ideas about, cryptids or the Loch Ness monster, whatever, it was just fun and still one of those things that can be a problem for people as well.
I want to, Jill, for your setting, since it is set, it has foundations and also in the future of our world, but it is set like in the future. I wanted to ask, how did you take the idea of building upon sort of how we are now and then building that into the future and creating that world? And also, what were some fun Easter eggs that you were able to include that maybe were tied to our world, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love science fiction, especially, people, it's obvious that science fiction takes place in the future, but it's always about now, right? And so it was really a fun exercise for me to think about elements of our lives and my daily life that I already outsource and kind of extrapolate those, right? We already have Grubhub, we already have care.com, we already have Handy, for repair and stuff. So we're already, asking people to come in and give of their time and talent to help us kind of fill in the gaps in our own lives so that we can save time for something else. Where it started to get kind of sci-fi speculative was, thinking about how the kind of more personal elements, things that we, right now would say like, oh, I wouldn't dare trade that. I wouldn't dare trade a date with my husband. I wouldn't dare trade, time with other loved ones. Or I wouldn't dare trade like the experience of like reading a good book, right? But if the technology was there, like maybe you would, right? Maybe you would say, oh, just this one, I'll hire someone to kind of, tell me what that book was about, or go look at the sunset and come tell me, how it made them feel. Cause I don't have time for that right now. So yeah, it was kind of interesting to just think about the sort of what it means from an interpersonal dynamic of like having somebody race across town to bring you a stick of gum or a slice of birthday cake, across, from, the Lower East Side to like West Harlem, right? Like that happens today. What it would mean to do that, faster, more all the time and kind of extrapolate that into the future. So yeah, that was kind of how I thought about the world building from that point of view. And a lot of the world building also trickles down from that idea of productivity. So like the food, they don't eat real food anymore. They eat like these little like kelp protein Vita bars because it's just faster and more efficient. It's got what you need, right? And it has like zesty chicken flavor just to make you feel kind of satiated. And then everything hinges on this idea of a productivity score, which again, like a lot of societies are not far from having something like that. Social credit scores in Asia, that kind of credit scores here, where, how productive you are informs, the kinds of privileges you have, how the law even treats you in this world, right? So like we have, analogies to that, in society today. They might not be as concrete, but they're certainly there. And then as far as Easter eggs, I had a lot of fun because some of what you get to do when you write about the future is make some sort of like statement about what elements of our culture today are going to persist. So I got to put in some fun Easter eggs about like books that still exist in the future, like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Tracy Dion's Legendborn series. I also got to, for fans of dystopia, I did put in some kind of Easter eggs of different references to other dystopian stories, different character names or foods that they eat that are clearly references to other kind of well-loved dystopian classics. So it was really fun.
I would like to remind everyone watching that if you have questions, you can drop them in the chat. I'm going to move on to some questions that are looking at some of the themes and elements of the books in a little bit more detail. My first question is about the friendship group, which is also at the core of A Misfortune of Lake Monsters. So, could you talk to us about creating these characters and oh, sorry, and and how you develop them alongside the main plot?
So, strong friendships are at the heart of everything I write in the young adult category because I've had the benefit of strong friendships in my own life, and I know how valuable they are when things in your life go sideways. And of course, being a teenager kind of sucks, and you really need people around you to survive it. And in Lake Monsters, the three main characters are Lemon, Troy, and Darren, and they've been tight for a really long time. Yet at the beginning of the story, Lemon's struggling with a life altering secret sort of responsibility that she can't share with them, which sort of sets up an interesting dichotomy. I needed her to be set apart a tiny bit from the group, which is why I made her female. And I needed Troy and Darren to have a different understanding of each other than they do of Lemon, which is why I chose them to be male. And Troy and Darren are loosely based on two college friends of mine who had this really incredible friendship. It was like a really great example to use. It was very much a bromance where they clearly loved and respected one another, but they still busted on each other endlessly. It was really like a sweet but sarcastic friendship. And Lemon was more of is more of an amalgam of people, but once I identified the character archetypes and inspirations for all of them, it was super easy to write. I mean, I lived with these people, sometimes in the same apartment for years, and so their voices were very much in my head. One of the greatest compliments I've gotten on Lake Monsters, a reviewer from SSF World said that the way that these characters interact with each other has a lived-in feeling. It just made me so happy that someone like could see that on the page.
Yeah, I love that description as well of a friendship like that. Um, in Night Owls and The Dividing Sky, your books feature multiple perspectives, and I was wondering if you could talk about how you use these multiple perspectives, how you approach this from a writing perspective in terms of secrets that one person has from other people, and how you balance what characters know and what readers know as well. You have these various kind of lenses. AR, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, so I just like to make things hard for myself. Every time I come, this was also like the book that died on sub was also told in 3 point of view characters. And every time I do this, I'm like, never again. And then inevitably, I'm like, oh, what if this one should have my point of view characters and all these interstitial chapters that are from like an omniscient perspective. So yeah, I mean, for me, how I approached writing it is actually like through those like interstitials in part, which for people who haven't read the book, there's these interstitial chapters that are told from like an omniscient, like folkloric storytelling voice that convey sort of in that tone backstory about the characters and additional folklore. And originally I was doing that for myself. I was doing it because I needed to know like what is the lore that these characters are coming from. And also I needed to have a strong sense of like what was the backstory. And very quickly when I was drafting those, for the most part, most of those I was able to like draft in a sitting, and then it kind of went into the book as is. Whereas like, let's say almost everything else is nothing, like they're not a single word from the first draft. Otherwise is like on the final page. So once I draft started doing these and I really liked them, I found it useful just to put in the story, but also for when I then sat down and wrote the 3 point of view characters. Because once if I had a really strong sense of like who they were and all this background about them, I knew what I could draw on to sort of distinguish themselves from each other. And I think beyond that, I think what was helpful in terms of figuring out like who knows what, was just reminding myself constantly that so the 3 point of view characters are Clara, Molly, and Boaz, the box office attendant who can see dead people. So he's human. And the other two are both, they're both Estries. They're, over 150 years old. So I had to continue really remind myself that. And I think I mean, throughout, Molly and Clara are keeping secrets from each other, so there are things that they don't know about the other. But they're sisters, so at the end of the day, they know a lot more about each other than Boaz knows about anything. He's also just a bit of a himbo. So, I mean, I just had to keep reminding myself that, but then it also just made things fun and kept it interesting.
I love a himbo. That's great. So yeah, the Dividing Sky is dual POV, so you get the perspective of both Liv and Adrian. And at the beginning of the book, they're really on opposite sides of the law. So Adrian is a forceman. He's part of this big corporation that runs the whole city, Life Corp. They're law enforcement. And Liv is a proxy, but she's also kind of like trying to make ends meet any way she can. So she's actually illegally selling a lot of the memories that she records for her clients to other lower class people, which you're not supposed to do. And that puts her on the radar of Adrian. And so she ends up getting an assignment from a client to go outside of this big metro city to the outer lands because he wants her to record a memory of her seeing the night sky and the stars for the first time. In the metro, there's too much light pollution, can't see the stars. She gets out there and Adrian tracks her down because he's trying to figure out, where this illegal dealing is coming from. And when he finds her, she has wiped her memories. She doesn't know who he is, doesn't know who she is, doesn't know that she's a criminal, what Life Corp is, like where they even are. And he is torn because he doesn't know if he can bring himself to condemn her for crimes that she doesn't even remember committing. And so you have this back and forth of her kind of figuring out who she, like trying to kind of navigate this outer lands area, wanting to go see the stars for some reason. She's not really quite sure why. And Adrian fighting for his life, falling for this girl, knowing that she's a criminal, like knowing he's not supposed to be, caring about her, that he's supposed to arrest her and take her in, but he can't bring himself to do it. And so they have these secrets that kind of trade off back and forth between them. And it was so fun from an author perspective. I think as a romance author, I love this tension of Adrian having like a mild panic attack about his morals slowly compromising, what he thinks he believes and the rules that he navigates his life by, kind of falling one by one as he begins to feel compassion and mercy for this girl, right? And then, the tension in the opposite side of having him lie to her about who he is and what they're doing out there, and then somehow still win, the reader's sympathy and Liv's sympathy, because you get that perspective of actually being in his head, seeing how he makes these decisions and what he's wrestling with as he grapples with how to do his job, but also keep her safe and how torn he is inside. And so, I love exploring those themes of, forgiveness and love and mercy and how they can be transformative for characters and kind of help them find this new path and this new world they end up figuring out by the end. And a lot of readers go into the book really ready to fight Adrian and then they root so hard for their love story by the end. So I love that.
Yeah, I feel like the world of both of your books are obviously so different, but I feel like the characters would, from both of your stories, specifically Adrian and Boaz, would like get along so well if they could just talk to each other and be like, "We're
I
both
love that.
struggling."
That's
Oh
awesome.
man. Oh, I will make sure I get your book as soon as I get off the call, so that
Same.
I can analyze, because I
Yes.
love this. I've found I've been doing that a lot now lately with other like writer friends, is just thinking about like how my characters would interact with theirs,
Yes.
and it's endlessly amusing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we love falling for someone that we don't think we should, and like secretly also having these cross purposes that you know about, that they might know about, but readers know about, which is why I wanted to like ask you both in the same question. Um, in Misfortune of Lake Monsters, I wanted to ask about the speculative fiction occurrences that you have in terms of the lake monsters, both real and unreal. And I wanted to know how you approached exploring using those speculative fiction occurrences of the monsters to explore kind of this broader world of both the stories, the government, and also the community within your stories.
So while Lemon and Troy are the main characters, I think that I'm using most to sort of explore the community and government and that kind of thing in the story, using Amelia and Darren. And Darren, of course, is the third of the friend group, but Amelia is sort of the new girl with an interesting past. And I won't go into that because it's spoilery. But Darren has like this encyclopedic knowledge of conspiracy, and he half believes it and half doesn't. And I think that when you're in a small town like Devil's Elbow, like the place where I grew up in, you're going to have an overabundance of people who believe in conspiracy theories for one reason or another, particularly right now, with the current political environment. And I think for most of us, people who are outside of that kind of environment, when you're looking at people who do believe in conspiracy theories, you kind of wonder how much of it they really do believe and how much of it is just sort of posturing, if that makes sense. And I think Darren serves as that does he not kind of a situation where you get to wonder. However, at the same time, both of them are involved in, and I'm trying to like hedge this so I don't say very much, in this other world where conspiracy theories really do exist. And to use them to play off of each other in different ways, I think was really useful in bringing sort of, maybe it's sort of the yin and the yang of conspiracy, the things that people believe with no evidence versus the things that people refuse to see despite the evidence. And that was a lot of fun to play with.
Yeah, you're definitely right. I made this question, obviously having read the book, so very privy to all the spoilers. And then as I was reading the question over again today, I was thinking, how will this work? How how will this question work? But I'm glad, yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Amelia and Darren, because I think that that is definitely like another aspect of the story and another lens to the town and like what's happening that we are not necessarily always seeing. Um, oh, sorry. I want to now also to ask about in Night Owls and the Dividing Sky, um, the idea of monstrous girls, and also like the idea of being villainized, being singled out, and also for your powers, for your abilities. And I was wondering if both of you could talk about how you explore this idea of monstrosity, villainy, and girlhood within your books. Didel, do you want to start?
Yeah. So Liv ends up being exceptional, not because of her natural abilities necessarily, but because of the desire to get ahead materially. So in this world, in the metro, everybody kind of starts off, you're born after like 6 weeks. I think your parents have a choice to either keep raising you and risk their productivity score falling, or giving you over to LifeCorp's employee care unit, which will take care of the child for you. And so Liv grows up essentially an orphan. She's, pushed through this like mandatory, short stint of schooling, and then pushed into working. So either in a factory or a warehouse. And the outlook is bleak unless somehow you're able to get this enhanced neurochip to become a proxy. And she ends up just falling into the kind of den of Silas, who's this kind of up and coming crew leader who decides to sponsor her and kind of take a chance on her. And so he's the one that pays for her emo proxy chip enhancement so that she can go and make something of herself and hopefully help the crew a little bit through her abilities. And so she's kind of made exceptional through that. And then Silas goes a step further and he begins to bring her books to read, which further enhance her empathy to make her kind of even more exceptional than an already kind of rare and prized emo proxy. And so she's kind of able to develop parts of her emotional spectrum that other emo proxies don't have access to. From there, again, all kind of in the name of helping to make a better circumstance for her loved ones. Silas does kind of require, there's a little bit of give and take. So, he helped her out. And so the expectation is that she helps him get what he needs, namely by helping him to shake down people who are late on their tithes. So if you're kind of in the slums and in the towers in this area, he is kind of like the local boss of that area. And so everyone kind of owes him a cut of their earnings. And if you don't, Liv is going to pair with you, and she's going to give some of her less pleasant emotions to you temporarily to kind of intimidate you into helping Silas. And so, Liv is certainly like villainized and made to use those powers for evil, from a young age, not because she necessarily wants to, but because she has this talent. And in this world where everything kind of serves the capitalist beast, kind of no matter whether you're part of the corporation or just struggling to get by, she has to kind of use force to be able to survive and to be able to help those people that she cares about survive. And those same powers are then villainized by the other side when she uses them in a way that's much less insidious and much less aggressive. Because simply by sharing her simple emotional memories of the sunset rising over, the skyscrapers, or, a field of flowers, whatever the case may be, she is selling those scraps to other lower class, which then makes them sort of a little bit less compliant, I should say, when it comes to the kind of authority of Life Corp and like their line managers at the factory and that sort of thing. And then that's seen as a threat as well, that she's kind of subverting the law and order of Life Corp. And so kind of no matter which way she spins it, the ability to share these powerful emotions with other people is a very strong tool and strong ability that those in power would see as a direct threat.
Yeah, I love that. No, that's really cool. For me, I know, like, originally that was kind of the heart of my book. I wanted to explore the way, like, women, like, I wanted to explore like the interior lives and desires of women, and the estuaries and sort of the vampire of it all became a way to do that. And to do that in sort of a specifically Jewish context. So, like, I was fascinated by the way that sort of hunger and ambition and desire in women generally, and in a Jewish context, are often a villainized quality in media and culture generally. So being able to kind of do that and sort of literally have it be a thing that makes, a girl a quote unquote monster, was a fun thing to play with. And it also let me sort of play with the other idea, which I find, endlessly fascinating and frustrating, which is like the way we remember, especially these kind of like hungry women from history, badly, or if we remember them at all. So, I mean, an early like issue I had to solve in the text was I wanted these characters to have lived like on the same street corner in New York City for like over 100 years. And like, how can they do that? Eventually someone will notice. So I, like, very quickly how I figured out how to do that is like, so I was reading another book. It was about like these like Jewish women, like partisan fighters in World War II. And a really fascinating element of it was like this section from a diary of like a male partisan in the group who talked about how the women in the unit were, they were the best fighters, they're the best spies, they can do things the men will never be able to do. And he says history will remember their names. And of course they didn't. The women that were covered in that particular book had been basically totally lost to history. And so that was kind of my answer. It was like, oh, like history is just so bad at remembering kind of exceptional women. They just fall out of people's memories. So that's what these would like, that's sort of for the estuaries, like that's kind of how they're able to live on the street block, but it's also kind of their tragedy is that they're just very quickly forgotten, particularly that sort of monstrous element of them. So yeah, I was just sort of playing with my own preoccupations, and sort of the fun of doing that in fantasy is you can make it literal and make them vampires and kind of play with all the fun parts of that as well.
That is the perfect segue to my next question, which is I wanted to know from all of you what draws you to the speculative fiction genre. So just a perfect segue. Nicole, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think all of our answers have given rise to the fact that speculative fiction in general is inherently political in nature, mostly because of the role of the other in it. But one of the interesting things that I think when I think about why I write speculative fiction is that there are very few rules that writers have to adhere to as there can be in other genres, like romance, for instance. There's always that expectation of the happily ever after. And there are, some other parameters that if you don't follow, people aren't going to really be excited to read it. But because of sort of the lack of rules in speculative fiction, oftentimes, there's no top to what's too weird. So in horror and dark fantasy in particular, and sci-fi for sure, most of the time the weirder the better. You can more easily slipstream genres. For instance, A Misfortune of Lake Monsters is marketed as horror, but there's a sci-fi twist in there. It's also considered cozy horror, and it's horror-mance. Someone the other day said it's as though Hallmark made a horror film, which made me laugh so hard because it's kind of true. And I love the freedom in that. It's not just the freedom to play, but the freedom to embed a political message in a really crafty way. And more than that, there's research that indicates people who consume horror or, dark fiction in general develop more resilient and better coping skills than those who don't. And I mean, that specifically had to do with the COVID pandemic. And it was the research was sandwiched at the beginning of that pandemic. But it's true overall. And I am all in on writing a genre that makes people stronger and better able to deal with their shitty situations.
I'll jump in. That's so cool. I didn't heard about that study. That's really interesting. Yeah, I touched on this earlier, but I really do think it's the ability, as Nicole was saying, to talk about our current society and political situation and social issues and all that in a way that is exaggerated, but I think also helps because it's exaggerated to draw to light some of those things, right? Like it's the allegory of it all, right? You can make up in The Dividing Sky, for example, there's a fictional drug called mean, which is a synthetic dopamine compound people inject to make themselves happier and more productive. And you can enhance your mean high by going to an institution called an arcade, where there are screens on every surface that are full of short burst clips of things that are meant to titillate and engage you. And it's just basically like a giant TikTok room, right? And I could have come out and said, like, TikTok is destroying our brains and like ruining true deep happiness and fulfillment for us. I could have said that, but it's more fun to put it in a speculative book that's set 300 years from now. So I really like playing with those ideas and saying something, but making it. I think sometimes like art, those statements when they're put through a lens of art can hit on a deeper level than when it's kind of read to you in like a kind of textbook or like a cold clinical way. So I love that. And then I also love the idea of like being able to play with different genres and fuse genres together. Dystopian romance is one of my favorites, and sci-fi romance, because you have this kind of core genre of science fiction or dystopia that we think of as cold or sterile or like bleak and kind of depressing. And then you put love in there, and it's just kind of this testament to the idea that like love and joy will always persist somehow, and they're going to shine through. And sometimes they shine that much brighter because of the backdrop that you put them against.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything that both of you guys said. I think it's just, for me, is like fantasy is just like what I really enjoy reading and what I pick up for fun. So I think at the core of what I enjoy doing this is because it's what I love as a reader. And again, it lets me sort of do all of the things and explore all the ideas I want to in the genre that I pick up for fun. And I think, especially for myself, I think the sort of delight of being, a published author now is getting to, created sort of the book that I had wanted as a reader and having that available on shelves. So, it's just it's kind of like that, the full circle of it all.
I mentioned, or something that you all mentioned before, is that your books are out. They've been published. And so I wanted to know from all of you what it's been like now that your book is in the world. And maybe how, your expectations about that have compared to the reality of it. And let's start with Jill, because your book, as you said, came out in October. So I think that was the last book from the three of yours that was released, but I don't even know what day it is, honestly, today. So the time has lost all meaning for me.
Right. Same. Yeah, it's been about 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks. And yeah, I think, it's so interesting. I think maybe I wonder if everyone else can relate to this, but there's something really interesting about like the month or two leading up to debut where you're just kind of this frantic ball of energy and just like, oh my gosh, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And then your book hits. And then it's like watching a train go by where you're just like, oh, like there it goes. Like, and now it's gone. And I don't mean gone in the sense of like, it's not available. Like obviously it's on shelves in stores, and which is incredible. There's just something interesting about like seeing the like pulsing machine of publishing like happen in real time where it's like, great, like on to the next shiny object. And I personally, I've come out of it, but I think like about a week after the book came out, I had like a 24-hour like real like doldrums period where I was like, man, like there it goes. And I think what has saved me from that and why I'm no longer in the doldrums period is that, once the book is out, like it's out. Like, people can read it and shout about it. And, I've had readers in my DMs saying like, thank you for writing this, and people that have just been so excited to receive their copies. I even like I went to a local store here in my area. They had one copy on the shelf, and I was like, okay, I'll go and sign one copy. It wasn't even face out, and I was like, man, like that's never gonna sell. Like, that's fine. Had a quick chat with the bookseller, left. Like 4 days later, I get a cold DM from somebody who's like, I was just at the store and I picked up a copy of your book because the bookseller recommended it, and I was looking for a YA book with a Black protagonist and like the speculative genre, and I felt like I'd read them all until I found yours, and like, thank you so much. And I was like, wow, like the idea that like me going into that one store and like introducing myself and signing one copy of a book can make someone's week like that, like that made my week. And I think it's just like what I think is so powerful about books, and what I'm reminded of all the time when I hear from readers is that writing a book is like sending up like a beacon into the sky of just like, here's my experience. Like, does anybody else feel this way? Right? Like, is it like this for you? And sometimes you feel like you're the only one who likes this weird mishmash of stuff. But then readers find it and they feel so moved and so seen. Even one book for one person can do that. And that's been really magical to be a part of.
Oh, totally. And I think I definitely agree. Both in terms of sort of like the ups and downs of like, the bits of doldrums. For myself, that's kind of come throughout the whole like process leading up to publication, like depending on the day or the week, or the hour. I don't know. There's been times where I've gotten like great news and bad news like in the same day, and it's a bit of a head trip. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely that sort of. It's a weird to like sort of anticipating something over the course of like 18 months, and then suddenly it's like, oh, and you're like, okay, what's next? But I think the comforting thing, especially too when I sort of despair, is knowing that books have a longer life, and not necessarily like, it's sometimes in publishing it can feel like everything is just leading up to like the week of the launch, and after that there's nothing. And it's like, no, I mean, again, how many books do I personally manage to read and respond to like the week of the launch? It's like books have a longer lifespan. They don't expire. And it's been really nice. I mean, again, the book hasn't been out that long, but it's nice to, run into people or hear people online who mention that they've discovered a cold, or, someone posts about it on Facebook and other people are like, oh, I've never heard of that. And it's like, oh, and it makes me feel better too when I sort of despair. It's like, no, people can, word of mouth is a powerful thing, and that people will just keep finding the book, when they find it. And that's been like the best part. I think the best part's just been getting to see that happen, and then also get to hear from readers who've like connected with the book.
One of the funniest parts of hearing this from the both of you is that so Lake Monsters came out in July, and one of the things that happened, I think, on the run up to publication is sort of that cover reveal. And Katie Wynn, who's one of our fellow 2024 debut authors, emailed me, I think it was like the week before my cover reveal happened. And she's like, just a warning, you're going to feel some type of way after this. You're going to have like a doldrums thing. And I'm like, oh. And she suggested having sort of a distraction. I'm like, I'm going to Barcelona. So I went to Barcelona for the weekend, and it really helped. But one of the other things that I found, not just necessarily like meeting people who have read the book, that sort of helps sort of get your head out of those spaces, doing new things. So I'd had a short story in an anthology a couple years ago, and the anthology got turned into an audiobook, but I had never had my own full book turned into an audiobook. And so the process of that, like moving the audiobook forward, like listening to the auditions, picking my top people, falling in love with the actors, that was like the most amazing kind of magic for me. And one of the cool things when I didn't actually mean to have a launch event, like I had absolutely no intention on doing this, and it just sort of happened. Stephanie Willing, who's a middle grade writer who was a 2023 debut author, was one of my narrators. And she lives in New York. She came down from New York to do what eventually became my launch event with me. And we were at a bookstore in Philly called Big Blue Marble. And she read with me, like she read a scene with me. And I remember thinking, oh my God, she's so amazing. And this is so not what I do. I'm going to suffer by comparison. It didn't even matter. It was so much fun. So like for me, that was sort of the most magical thing about this entire process, and sort of how just sort of that one process that has led throughout the book really helped me see sort of my journey to publication and being published in a different way than I think I would have otherwise.
Yeah, I love what you all are bringing up about the shelf life of a book and like when it begins and the evergreenness of it. And also, I feel like it is a bit easier to promote when people can also just immediately go get it. There is sometimes it's hard to kind of get people to commit to getting something that will happen in like 6 months. And whereas now it's like, oh, you can get it right now, immediately. Um, Last question that I have kind of relates to something you were AR was saying earlier, which is about teenage selves. And I want to know, if you gave your teenage self your book, this book, what would you say and what would your teenage self say? So, AR, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, especially I was like in high school at the peak of Twilight. And I was like a huge Twihard. So I think if I could like meet 14-year-old Ariel or me, and then present her with the vampire book that I wrote, I think like her head would explode. Um, and also like other things. I do try to live my life in general in a way that would make 14-year-old me proud. Um, and I try. Um, I think she'd be pleased.
Yeah, I think teenage me would lose her mind. I loved science fiction as a kid and as a teenager. I remember, I think I imprinted on that movie, The Fifth Element, with Bruce Willis, like really, really hard. And I love that movie, and I feel like that's like my whole personality in a nutshell. Yeah, like I said, I started writing and just in general because of Divergent, and I love these, classic 2010s YA dystopian stories, The Hunger Games, Scythe, Uglies, all these stories that ask these really big universal questions about the human experience and have big things to say about where we're headed if we're not careful. And I've always loved those stories, even like, for Fahrenheit 451 and Brave New World in 1984. Dystopian stories are just so accessible and like applicable to all of us. But the main characters always looked a very specific way. And so, to me, to be able to give like a teenage version of myself a book that asks those big questions and has two Black main characters would be like monumental. I think just like enormously, enormously overwhelming for her. Yeah.
I think in my case, my teen self would be like, why are you writing about this hometown of ours? Like, I wanted to escape so badly that like I couldn't imagine looking at it in a way that I didn't hate it. And as an adult, I can look at that and see things in there that are good and worthy of being. But at the same time, I really used sort of my feelings about hating high school and hating the town I grew up in and hating that people expected me to be a certain way and that I wasn't. And sort of putting all that into a character that asks, how much of yourself do you owe to other people? And I think my teenage self would be proud of my adult self for doing that, but you never know. I was kind of a brat back then. You never know.
That's so fair. I don't know. I think my teenage self would be like pretty deeply embarrassed by me. um, I lied. I want to ask one more question actually, which is, it's two more months left of the year, less than. So I want to know, what is one of your top 10 books that you read this year? Which is so cruel because just made a video the other day talking about how much I hate having to come up with these kinds of lists. So and so many people also empathize with that. So I'm just gonna pass it on to all of you, and also also make you all answer that question as well. Jill, do you want to start?
Yes, you're just sharing the pain. I'm gonna cheat because I'm gonna say a nonfiction book, so I don't have to like think about other stories. I read a book called The Underworld by Susan Casey, and I don't think it came out this year, but it is about like the deep sea. So it's like way below like where light penetrates, like the creatures and the different flora and fauna and ecosystems that are down there, and also kind of man's quest to dive down to those depths and kind of the different things we've tried to get a good sense of what's down there and all the technological advances and experiments that have been held in order to get a good look down there. So very cool book.
AR, do you want to go?
Oh, sure thing. Yeah, no, I loved Us in Ruins by Rachel Moore, who I met through my editor, but even if I hadn't met her, loved this book. It's I think her pitch for it was that it was the Lizzie McGuire movie meets The Mummy, which is exactly the vibe. It's about it's like a action adventure romance paranormal rom-com between this like girl who's going on like an archaeology trip for school, like to Rome, and are like the like accidentally frozen 1920s like archaeologist, surly, grumpy boy, who's unfrozen and has to help her like find like the missing object. It is so much fun, and it's like a comfort movie but a book. Highly recommend it.
And I have just grown my to be read list by 2. So thank you. I think, so the thing that I read this year that I loved the most was Mother Thing by Ainsley Hogarth. It didn't come out this year. It came out in 2022. The circumstances when I read it, I think made it more funny than it should have been. I was at jury duty and we were just standing there forever. And I finished this book and the woman next to me was like, I am so bored. Do you have anything I can read? I'm like, here. And I'm like, sorry, because it's pretty horrific. And if you haven't read it yet, it has to do with a relationship and a relationship with a mother-in-law. And yeah, I highly recommend it, but it was really great. And I felt bad for like giving this unsuspecting woman this book. And I can only imagine her going home and being like, the woman who was sitting next to me at jury duty was a freak. Now, if I'm going to go with something that was published this year, I'm definitely going to go with Lockjaw by another one of our 2024 debut authors. I'm going to get his first name wrong. Matteo Cirilli. It's super great. Also really creepy.
I feel like we need to find out what this person thought of that book. That was
I really, really wish that I would have gotten her name just so I could have like stalked her on social media to see if she said anything. Because I want to know. I want to know if she ended up loving it or like if she was new to horror. I like the idea of introducing someone to really something creepy.
Could do like a Craigslist misconnection or something.
Yes, I think that would be so perfect because it's so specific as well that I feel like if it found the right corner of the internet or like the right person, it would just be the ultimate thing. Like the best way to end 2024, basically.
I'm telling you, like, it seems like in election season, it shouldn't be hard to find people. I mean, I don't live in a county that's that big. I don't know.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who watched. Also, thank you so much to the panelists. As I mentioned earlier, the books are available immediately, so you can just go and pick them up immediately afterwards. I put all the bookshop links down below in the description box, so definitely please go do that. And just another thank you to everyone involved as well. I hope you all have a really great rest of your day and the rest of your 2 months minus 3 days. 3 days left of 2024. Bye.